Hello everyone, my name is Marcel Măcelaru and I would like to talk to you on the issue of power and how the Bible interprets power, subverts power and addresses powerlessness. We live in a world of conflicting power claims, unscrupulous power mongers and violent power plays. The ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, to take the most recent example, has once again proven that the proud modernist claim of enhanced civility resulting from increased knowledge and access to information does not reflect contemporary experience. This dire reality inevitably prompts the question, what has gone wrong? Or where have we failed? And of course, are there any solutions to the crisis facing our society? Moreover, as Christians, we ought to ask what are the resources and methods available to us so that we become engaged in subverting powers while safeguarding the powerless. Thus, within the context of today's world, reflection on the topic Jesus and Empire, Christian witness in the context of power, is a most urgent theological task. As a biblical scholar, I propose that the resources available to us can be found in the sacred text, and the method is to read this text anew so that imaginations are rekindled and receivers of the message are empowered to act for the well-being of their neighborhoods. Therefore, what I offer in this paper is a hermeneutical exercise in which I focus on three biblical images related to the pair power-powerlessness, and at the end I will draw a few implications thereof. The first text I selected for this hermeneutical exercise is Psalm 72, which is a prayer old King David makes for his son, Solomon. The imagery is overwhelming as the text portrays a king that exercises immense power and authority. The claim the psalm seems to make is that the king's all-encompassing power is divinely ordained, and the prayer is that this arrangement of the world will last until the moon is no more. Not unlike hundreds of examples throughout the history of humanity, the socio-political ideology underscoring such claims is both arrogant and monopolizing. Shockingly, however, the psalmist does not allow our imaginations to wander in the direction of vicariously feeding our own desires for power and control. For soon enough, the prayer turns to prophecy, and the vision portrays a kingdom unlike any other, a realm in which justice and righteousness will prevail, health and well-being will be the norm, and prosperity will have no end. And it is here, within this image, that the subversion of human notions of power surfaces. For the rise and endurance of such kingdom, and of any kingdom for that matter, is contingent in the psalm on caring for the poor and the needy. The very right to rule in the psalm is dependent upon the resolve of the king to act on behalf of the disadvantaged members of the society, while also curbing the power of the oppressor. As such, the psalm is both validation and warning. Validation of the king's rule, and warning against this rule to becoming anything else but the blessing for the needy it is supposed to be. The psalm therefore undermines, criticizes, and corrects notions of power and authority. Its prophetic domestication of the royal power ideology typical to the ancient Near Eastern society of Solomon, if rightly received, can become a social-political imaginary today that will reorient the accelerating social ideologies of the psalm's receivers in the present. The second text I offer is Isaiah chapter 11 from verses 1 to 9. Here the prophet describes God's program of restoration that comes through the birth and rule of a unique king. The reign described is not the typical display of arrogance, violence, and power we have come to expect from earthly rulers, but it is a display of simpleness and innocence, as delicate an appearance as that of a child who is shepherding beasts. The characteristics of this kingdom are justice in all matters, either judicial or political, order and welfare for all its subjects, equity and protection for the weak and vulnerable members of the society, relational harmony with God, with the neighbor, and with the creation. The startling contrast between human and divine notions of power available in Isaiah's child metaphor is later on picked by Jesus in Matthew chapter 18, who places a child in the midst of a debate about power. This gesture is Jesus' way of providing the disciples engaged in a typically human arrangement of the world with the alternative of divine wisdom, the wisdom which uses the weak things of this world to shame the great and the powerful, according to 1 Corinthians 1:27. It strikes me as wonderfully odd that both Isaiah and Jesus place a child in the midst of our theme. In both texts, the child becomes a signifier of God's rule that challenges any human notion of how rule is to be carried out. In fact, it challenges any human notion of rule altogether, for both the child in the midst of beasts in Isaiah and the child in the midst of a beastly adult argument in Matthew overturn the normal order of things in which rule equals power, enforcement, and in most cases violence. Within the biblical world, the child imagery would have shocked its receivers even more than it startles us, because the social status of children was one of humility and simplicity, of complete dependence on another for both her identity and her survival. And yet, in spite of this, both Isaiah and Jesus claim in unequivocal terms that the child is crucial in the strive to become part of God's kingdom. In Isaiah, the child leads. In Matthew, the child is a pointer to entering the kingdom. As such, the child is at the same time a theological metaphor, for it signifies the coming of God's rule, an educational metaphor, for it exemplifies the nature of that rule, and a missiological metaphor, for it leads everyone who is ready to change a step closer in the direction of God's blessed kingdom. Evidently, this biblical text speaks about a reality that seems unavailable to us. The message is so unthinkable that the contrast between human notions of power and the divine preference for powerlessness must be delivered in metaphorical language, and its application has oftentimes remained exclusively in the realm of eschatological possibility. The main feature of such a hermeneutic is that it relegates the blessed consequences of God's lordship to an undetermined future, and this is also, of course, its Achilles heel, because an interpretation exclusively referring to the future overshadows any application such biblical text may have in the present. The proposal I make is that a hermeneutical shift is necessary in order that such texts are revealed as theological, ethical, and missiological resources for today. This shift entails the search for socio-political applications of the Bible that will redirect our interpretive perspective from an exclusive eschatological understanding of God's blessed kingdom as a future reality to the understanding that Christ's lordship includes the redemption and transformation of our lived reality into a reality shaped by God's vision for the creation. Methodologically, I suggest that the notion of imaginary is important to this task. Imaginary refers to how people intuitively understand the world in light of cultural, social, political, and religious information that belongs to their context, and should be distinguished for imagination, which is the faculty individuals possess to form new ideas. The use of imaginary as a feature of socio-cultural perception can be traced back to Benedict Anderson's claim that awareness of one's national identity is instilled through instinctive social practice rather than through taught social theory and intentional choice. The consistent socio-political application of the concept, however, is the merit of Charles Taylor, who speaks of social imaginary as a group's mindset, the criteria by which we judge socio-political arrangements as legitimate or not. Building on Taylor's theory, theologian James K. Smith has explained that social imaginary is an affective, non-cognitive understanding of the world. It is described as an imaginary rather than a theory because it is fueled by the stuff of imagination rather than the intellect. It is made up of and embedded in stories, narratives, myths, and icons. These visions capture our hearts and imaginations by lining our imagination, as it were, providing us with frameworks of meaning by which we make sense of our world and our calling in it. Evidently, here I argued that the biblical text discussed ought to be interpreted as being more than a projection for the future. If socio-political directions of interpretation are taken into account, these texts have the potential to shape up a community's social imaginary in the present. Such imaginary would organize the language of hope these texts contain in political categories, and therefore it would also organize the instituting processes of the political in the world of their receivers by addressing and amending its congruent social realities. As such, the most important aspect of a social imaginary is its potential to sponsor theological ideas that speak to concerns in the contemporary public arena. Seen in this way, the potential of this text as social imaginaries resides exactly in the fact that the non-limitative character of their metaphorical language translates into non-limitative applications of this language within each interpretive context where they are read. As such, the image of a blessed messianic existence where abusive power is replaced by justice for the powerless, evoked by this text, is no longer an exclusive reference to a future unavailable to the reader. Rather, it becomes the horizon of possible experiences in which the Bible displaces its readers. Admittedly, the world evoked by this text does not conform to the reality experienced by the interpreter. However, I suggest that it is exactly the metaphorical portrayal of this utopic world that provides the biblical text with the necessary persuasive power to operate as socio-political imaginary. To explain, the use of metaphorical language forces the reader to participate in the process of meaning-making by formulating the possible out of the impossible. As such, the resulting imaginary is further realized as a constituent element in the interpreter's worldview. In other words, the images evoked by this text inform the present. Consequently, the appreciation of these prophecies, of these texts, as socio-political imaginary forces the reader to also engage in a process of world-making, because such rekindling of one's imagination prompts the reader to effect changes in his lived reality, so as to resemble the world thus far available only in rhetorical representation. Interpreted in this way, the very reception of such texts becomes an act of imaginative freedom that serves to activate and transform reality. I would like to conclude this paper by spelling out three implications of such a socio-political reading that would lead us to not only being informed, but also prompt us to be obedient and change in our personal and institutional behaviors. The first implication has to do with restoring relationships. The passages that I presented before portray right relationships as an important feature of God's rule. They first speak of a covenantally based understanding of God and His ways, but such a commitment to the Holy One, who is righteous and faithful, has inevitable consequences. It produces an environment where human beings can commit themselves to one another in trust, and an environment where their role within God's creation is restored. Relating to the theme of the conference, such emphasis on relational rightness raises a powerful challenge, for it speaks of the fact that within God's kingdom people are more important than institutions and policies. The implication is that we are called to participate in creating social good and curbing social evil as a way of anticipating the ultimate judgment, when God will act decisively to stop all evilness, individual and national, spontaneous or institutionalized. The second implication has to do with the practice of hospitality. The reign of God in this text can be defined as shalom. It speaks of a context within which fear, insecurity, danger, evil, and violence find no place. The metaphorical language used suggests a radical reversal, an existence where our definitions of strength and weakness are challenged. It calls for a change of attitude I would describe as true hospitality. Hospitality testifies to a basic understanding of common humanity that goes beyond established differences, beyond the possibility of aggression and rejection, in order to embrace in the same way friend and foe, kinfolk and stranger. It testifies to a world where one does not hesitate to provide for the needs of the neighbor and the foreigner, and by doing so to become a reflection of divine provision and embrace. Such practice of hospitality, I believe, is an alternative that changes lives. It brings back into our world kindness and compassion, and where kindness and compassion rule, indifference, selfishness, and other causes for divisiveness are eliminated. In terms of witness to Christ, in the context of power, the practice of hospitality prompts us to make space for the other, to pursue dialogue rather than debate, to understand that within God's world, unity happens in diversity, and therefore that human existence is not about isolationist attempts at uniformization and therefore control, but about harmonious living with and for the other. The third and final implication is a life lived by faith. Finally, the passages ultimately describe a world yet unavailable within the earthly realities we know and experience. Therefore, such alternative can only be perceived through the eyes of faith. I would define faith here as the courage to imagine new possibilities and to act accordingly in the present. As such, faith becomes an exercise of imaginative freedom which, in its construal of reality, goes beyond the obvious, beyond our sensory perceptions, beyond the ways others define reality for themselves and for us. It is by faith that one sees purpose in human life and history, by faith that God's promises shape one's reality. Ultimately, the reign of God, these passages announce, is perceived in the here and now, and it can be enacted by faith alone. For it is by faith that new possibilities are discovered, and in faith that blessed alternatives are sought and applied. Witnessing to Christ from this perspective becomes proclamation, for faith gives our theologizing a prophetic dimension. Faith changes one's perception of God and God's action within the creation, and consequently changes the theological tune he or she sings. Faith makes the difference. It changes the focus of our theologizing from dry, impersonal, philosophical arguments to practical, applicable, and living truths that have the power to affect our communities. The implication thereof is that a life lived by faith is a challenge to many treasured notions of security and stability. A life lived by faith will seek first the kingdom of God, that is, the counsel of divine wisdom, rather than human notions of proven and recommended courses of action. A life lived by faith will speak and act out the ethos of God's kingdom at all times and in all circumstances, regardless of how challenging or unsound that may appear to be. A life lived by faith is ultimately subverting human notions of power and control and embraces the divine example of powerlessness. In Dietrich Bonhoeffer's words, this example that God gives us has to do with how God has entered the world. I will end my paper with a quote from Bonhoeffer. God allows himself to be edged out of the world and onto the cross. God is weak and powerless in the world, and that is exactly the way, the only way, in which he can be with us and help us. It is not by his omnipotence that Christ helps us, but by his weakness and suffering, because only a suffering God can help. Thank you.